Everyone, welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Before we get into the podcast proper and the introduction for the podcast proper, just wanted to give you a heads up that we had some internet connection issues with our guest. So there's probably going to be a couple of places in this episode where there's some pretty obvious edits. Rest assured, we're not editing for content. We never ever do. We never ever will. We're just trying to make the cutouts that we had a little bit less clunky. So all of that being said, enjoy. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Today, our guest, we're very excited to have on the show. She is somebody who has not only been active in Alberta politics, but who has, for quite some time now, provided a unique perspective on Alberta politics through her somewhat unstoppable approach to social media and social media platforms. So we're very, very grateful to have Kathleen Smith on the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Kathleen.
Good day, eh? Glad to be here.
That's a strong Canadian opening you've got going on there.
That's about the friendliest I'm going to be. So
perfect. I think I've established that I have no problems with confrontation. So
cool. And I'll try to keep the curse words to a minimum.
Thank you. We do try to be somewhat family oriented for our three viewers. To start with. You have established a very strong presence in the social media realm around Alberta politics and a bunch of other stuff as well. But before we get into sort of that, can you tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about how you started blogging and social media-ing?
Sure. I'm like to call myself an early adopter of online life. I've been online since about 91, 92, and I mean dial-up 14.4 modem, early days of online interaction. I've always been politically aware because I'm at my heart a nerd and a geek, and that's kind of what we do. It wasn't until about 2012, maybe a little before that I really started getting interested in Alberta politics, because after 40 years of a conservative dynasty and a voting populace that just seemed rooted into a conservative or die mindset, I really wanted to see a change come to Alberta, and it was a long overdue change. And started exploring other parties. And that exploration led me initially to, wait for it, the Wild Rose Party of Alberta. I attended a leaders' dinner. It's not unfair to say I was impressed by Danielle Smith's presentation. She was the leader of the party at that point in time. And I asked a few questions about social issues that were near and dear to my heart, specifically birth control rights for women and full equality for LGBTQ2 persons, societal and legal, and of course, how the WRP as a government would reconcile Alberta's history with Indigenous persons. And of course, the answers I got to that from members and from Danielle Smith herself seemed positive initially. And then over the days and weeks, as I did more of my own research, I discovered the conscience rights policy and found that to be unacceptable and extremely disturbing as to what it could mean, not just for women in this province and our reproductive rights, but also for my LGBTQ2 friends and family members. And at that point in time, I had an online magazine called kikiplanet.com. I should clarify, I've never been a blogger. I was the publisher.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay. A lot of people assume that I was, but I ran an online magazine that profiled the city of Edmonton, power couples, pop culture. We had a book club, and we also had political op-ed on that site. So I wrote a piece called Confessions of a Wilted Wild Rose that exposed this conscience rights policy, why I was opposed to it, and made clear that the policy was enough for me to abandon the party.
Now, if I can just jump in real quick, just for our listeners who might not be familiar with, the term conscience rights is very broad and open to some interpretation depending on who you're having the conversation with. So for our listeners, can you just clarify what that policy was with the Wild Rose and why it grated against your beliefs?
Conscience rights legislation would provide doctors and business owners with the legal right to discriminate against LGBTQ2 persons and also pharmacists, and to deny women access to birth control, the morning after pill, and abortion.
Okay, so this is very much in line with the same sort of conscience rights bill that we saw UCP MLA Dan Williams try to introduce a little while back.
Exactly. And conservative and far-right conservative governments have been trying to bring forth this kind of legislation for quite some time. It's discriminatory. It's an attack on women. It was more than I can stomach. So I wrote about it, and the post quickly went viral. It was an emotional and passionate election season. Alison Redford was leading the PCAA, and there was a revolt against the conservative dynasty. And as much as we needed it to change, I didn't think the Wild Rose was the party to do that. The post went viral, and as a result, it was days and nights of personal attacks, threats to burn down my home, threats to kill me, just the usual things that women face online. And that only amplified the post in the end. And that resulted in my developing, for better or for worse, a large presence on the local social media season.
Where did you go from the Wild Rose?
Well, I sat it out for being a party member for a while. I decided I wanted to be able to speak from a place of sincerity and honesty. And the only way I could do that is if I was not a member of any party, which I'm still not today. I'm not a member of any provincial or federal party. And I think it's important I let people know that, because I don't want them to immediately write off anything I say as being a specific party's policy. I did for a time support the Alberta Party. I liked what they were doing with the Big Listen. I liked that the then president of the Alberta Party, Glenn Taylor, was the first one out of the box to decry the Wild Rose conscience rights policy. He didn't have to consult with strategists. He didn't have to consult with a caucus or a board. He immediately reacted and said, "This is unacceptable." And that immediately drew me in. Like, here is a party that is not afraid to just put it out there. Unfortunately, we've seen the Alberta Party change quite a bit over the past few years, and I've disassociated with them as a result of not agreeing with a lot of their policy. So now I'm just an independent loudmouth online.
Okay, perfect. I actually used to support the Alberta Party as well, and I don't anymore.
And I mean, it's a conversation we can have at another time. But I really think the Alberta Party had a chance. They had a base of political nerds and geeks who were really smart, who had some great ideas. But Jason Kenney rolling back into this province really threw the Alberta Party for a loop, I think, and resulted in a lot of stuff happening that I wasn't crazy about. So yeah, here I am out in the political wilderness.
Yeah, I feel you. But you haven't gotten quieter. I don't think is if anything, it seems like your commentary, I'll call it,
Sure.
I don't know.
Let's go with that.
Has gotten more passionate and more to the point. What's driven that for you?
Oh, I think especially over the last 5 to 6 years, I've experienced an overwhelming amount of loss in my life. I think most of my followers know I lost my son to suicide just shortly after losing my son. Like a matter of weeks later, my dad unexpectedly dropped dead of a heart attack. Just shortly after that, my kid sister, who was 49, dropped dead of hypertension in her living room. Then my youngest child, my daughter, was diagnosed with severe ulcerative colitis, and we almost lost her. And when you have to deal with that loss within a system that has not been supportive to the mentally ill, within a healthcare system where the government of the day is at war with our frontline workers, it does make you more passionate. Because even though you might not be fighting for yourself, you know what other people are enduring and dealing with on a daily basis, and that makes you want to fight for them and with them.
I'm curious, as what's your? I mean, to me, in my own personally totally biased opinion, it seems like we have a government right now that is committed to ideology in a way that I don't know that we've seen in 40 or 50 years from an Alberta government. How is that sort of? What's your take? Like, am I completely out to base with that, or?
No, no, I don't think you are. And I don't want to assign that to the entire UCP membership. I know a lot of the membership. I mean, they're my neighbors. Some of them are my family members, and I know at their core they are good people. And I know some of them are good people who vote conservative out of habit. It's the Alberta way. I guess what I see is a premier who is married to his ideology. And I don't say that lightly. His ideology is his life partner. That's the one thing that has been the constant in his life forever. And I think it's very difficult for someone who is that married to their ideology to accept that perhaps their ideology doesn't fit with our current circumstances because they don't know anything else. And I think that that makes it very difficult for him to look past his own belief system, because when we're forced to look past our own belief system, it causes us to doubt ourselves. You know, when we become our ideology, anything that causes us to question that ideology is like blowing a hole in our perception of ourselves. And that's not easy for anyone, let alone someone like our premier, who has been doing this for most of his life.
With that being said, we've certainly seen a lot of fascinating developments over the last little while in regards to our current circumstances. But today we're recording this on November 26th. There has been some pretty significant news in regards to how that ideology has apparently been driving the COVID response from the province. So for our listeners, the Coles notes of it is that there were some secret recordings, because apparently we're living in Nixon era now. But there were some secret recordings that were released to the CBC that detail that, as many Albertans had speculated, the advice that the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Henshaw, has been providing to the government has been utilized in part, and it hasn't necessarily been followed in the way that perhaps many Albertans would have liked it to have been followed. I'm trying to be very generous here.
I was just going to say, you're so generous. That's so nice of you.
Well, we've already been threatened with a couple of lawsuits, so I try to we don't have the money for a lawyer, so I try to tread on the middle ground there. But what's sort of your take on what we've learned today, as well? How much of it do you think is driven by Mr. Kenney's ideology, and how much of it, like, is there a chance? I know I'm asking these three-part questions here, but do you think there's a chance that he might adjust his approach?
No, I don't think he will. I think that's why these tapes made their way into the media, is because those around him know that he's not going to change his approach. I think his press secretary, or is it his deputy press secretary, whoever it is, their response to this speaks volumes too. It was an unprofessional, dismissive, attack the media response instead of putting out something thoughtful that could have calmed Albertans. They just allowed it to be even worse.
This seems to be a pattern of behavior from this government and their communications people, where rather than focusing on clear, consistent messaging, the goal seems to be winning at all costs.
Yes.
And that's, I think that's, I mean, to me, that's one of the things that has me the most concerned, as somebody who's been involved in some of the disaster responses in our provinces. One of the most important things is clear communication. And I think we've seen that from some of the other response agencies. I would look to the Director of Emergency Management for Calgary. His messaging has been very, very clear. It's been very, very strong. Unfortunately, he's retiring in just a couple of days here. But we haven't seemed to have seen that same consistency or strength of messaging from this government. Do you have any speculation as to why you think that might be?
Well, first of all, a lot of their communication staff is inexperienced and unqualified for the jobs they're in. They don't have the experience to be responding in what would be normal times, let alone in a national crisis, an international crisis. They're not equipped to do that. And if I'm being quite honest, and I know I've mentioned this to you before, there is a meanness to this government that I don't understand. And especially right now during this pandemic, the meanness is uncalled for. It's irrational. Their response is time and time again to own the libs. It's like mean kids on a schoolyard. And it's very hard to get a populace behind the government of the day and behind the premier when day after day we are being insulted by the people they pay to communicate with us. So of course there is going to be resentment, there's going to be backlash, there's going to be hard feelings, because a lot of this province has been feeling for a while like this government only exists to own us.
And that's sort of one of the things that I struggle with is the fact that there is, like you say, that meanness there. It seems like the winning at all costs includes alienating as much of Alberta as possible if need be. And what's particularly fascinating to me is that I think that's reflective of the leadership style. Because, I mean, in any organization, the tone comes from the top. And the fact that, we have these issues managers and press secretaries and billion other staffers who have no problems taking extremely aggressive, extremely condescending tones on social media, that comes from somewhere. And the fact that we've now seen with this article today that apparently the leadership is taking similar tones with their advisors, that's what I think is most alarming, because if we have a government that is not willing to listen to alternative viewpoints, that may be more qualified and that may be more effective, and immediately dismisses any viewpoint other than their own, as you said, owning the libs, that leaves us in a very precarious position, I think.
It does. And I think this meanness, this snideness, this arrogance, this demeaning of anyone who doesn't support their policies and their positions is counterproductive to getting us through this pandemic with the least amount of costs, not just of lives, but to our economy as well. Because what happens is we all root into our positions. And the more rooted we become, the further down the political spectrum we go. So the right gets rooted in and they move right, and the left gets rooted in and they move left. And then we're even more divided and more confrontational with each other, when what we really need is a government and a premier who, especially now, unites us. And we're not seeing that. I think it's not just a lost leadership opportunity for our premier, who could have been sailing on this. He could have been the leader we're craving, and chose instead to pander to a specific minority faction of the province. It's a loss for all of us. As horrible as this time is, it did come with an opportunity to unite us and to force us to listen to each other. And unfortunately, our government has not seized upon that opportunity, and has in fact taken an approach that is diametrically opposed to unifying the province.
It's one of the fascinating things to me is that there's an expression, don't ever let any good crisis go to waste, because there is always opportunity inherent in any crisis. And I mean, I'm curious on what your take is. We saw today an interview or not an interview, rather a chunk of video come out, where Mr. Kenney talked about the fact that even if he did mandate masks, he doesn't believe that people would follow that lead, which is a truly remarkable stance to take for a premier of a province during a crisis of this magnitude. Do you think that he thinks that he has the leadership chops to handle this crisis, or is he just completely overwhelmed by everything that's going on?
Well, I think he's overwhelmed, but not for the reason most people expect. I think he's overwhelmed because he's never been in this kind of situation before. Jason Kenney's never struggled politically speaking. Also, there's life experiences that he doesn't have, and I'm not going to beat him down for that. I'm not going to say it makes those things alone make him inadequate as a premier, but there's more to leadership than just legislation. There's your life experience in compassion. There's your life experience in loss. There's all these other factors that support good leadership, and he doesn't have those. I don't envy the position he's in.
It's like, to go with your life partner metaphor from earlier. To me, I think that he's largely been relying on his life partner for most of his political life, and his life partner wasn't built for these circumstances, and so it seems like to me that he's kind of had that thing to always go to, and that thing was always right. And it has to be a huge crisis of identity to have that thing that you've relied on for 50 some odd years and find it wanting in a circumstance like this.
Well, it's definitely a losing my religion scenario, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. And I'm sure there's a lot of people across the country who are facing that same sort of come to Jesus moment if you will. A lot of us are re-examining our ideology, our political leanings, our spirituality. That's what a crisis brings with it. But we can either turn those into gifts, or we can throw our hands up in the air and dig in deeper and become rooted. And I fear that our premier is unswayable. He is immovable when it comes to his ideology, because that's all he knows. And I think that is problematic for us and for our province as a whole.
One of the other sort of areas that I'd like to sort of pick your brain on, what do you what if you had a crystal ball, where would you say? I mean, people ask me for my opinion sometimes about, like, oh, Nate, where do you think provincial politics is going? And over the last year, my reaction has been, I don't know, man. This could go, like, if you'd told me a year ago that we'd be where we are now and handling it in the way that we are now, I would have probably laughed. So, like, right now, if someone was to say to me, Nate, in the next year, there's going to be a flaming unicorn that descends out of the sky and sets up shop out front of the legislature, my immediate reaction would be like, yeah.
Yeah, it's possible. That tracks.
What? How many people in Alberta do you think are feeling the same way?
Well, if Kenny's approval ratings are to be believed, a heck of a lot. I mean, he's fallen to, what is it, around 30% approval rating. People are worried. People are scared. And we're desperate for a strong leadership to get us through this. I mean, even in the worst crisis, if your leader instills confidence in the people, that's half the battle. We saw it with Brian Jean during the Fort Mac fires, where he went up there and lived in a tent, where he was on the ground with his constituents, and he was loved and adored for it. We saw it with Nenshi during the floods, and not just how well he managed that, but what it did for his persona in the city, what it did for his popularity. And that's why this is such a missed opportunity for Kenny. On the flip side of that, this is Alberta. And we have a conservative ride or die attitude here. We have a large part of the populace that votes out of habit, votes the way their grandfather and their father did. So will this in the long run make a difference in his re-election chances? I don't know. I think if the economy comes back next year, then it may go well for him. But I also think we've got a new generation of voters in this province, and they tend to lead left. And if they're motivated enough, Kenny may be fighting a battle he's never fought before in his political career.
Well, this is another one of the interesting pieces. You bringing up his approval ratings, and the reason why I say that it's interesting is because there has very much been in Alberta the perception that it's conservative ride or die, as you said, but it almost seems like that there's a growing number of people who did vote UCP conservative, who are starting to question whether or not the UCP brand of conservatism is in fact the brand of conservatism that they're known by. I think there's certainly no shortage of people who looked at the UCP on the ballot and went, that's the Conservative Party, that's who I always vote for, without being aware of any of the issues of the background. Do you think, I mean, you're talking about the fact that you know a lot of people who supported the UCP. Are you seeing any sort of increased awareness or an awakening in regards to whether or not Mr. Kenny's brand of conservatism is not perhaps the brand of conservatism that Alberta's used to?
Not really.
No?
No, I think, Stephen Carter of The Strategists, fame. Stephen Carter has often reminded me that the vast majority of Albertans are not online. The vast majority of Albertans are not politically engaged. What is it? 50% of us show up on voting day, if we're lucky. And then how much of that percentage is actually informed before they vote? So I'm not seeing a lot of change. The hyper engaged people who are online, I've seen a few here and there who have said this isn't what I voted for. Well, it is what you voted for. We told you this would happen, the pandemic notwithstanding. So I don't know what it's going to take for Alberta to start holding conservative governments accountable, because that's not a part of our history. And I'm not sure if it ever will be a part of our history. I think Alberta needs a major paradigm shift before that could ever happen. Now, the one caveat I'll give to that is the oil industry is not coming back. I know you're probably going to get a lot of hate mail for that, but
I've been saying that for months.
yeah, the oil industry isn't coming back, and as generous as I've tried to be with our premier up to this point, he lied to us. He lied to all of Alberta. It's not coming back. You're not getting that 6-figure oil rig job back, friend. I'm sorry about that. It's just the truth of the matter. So that might be enough for us to see a major split on the right. We might see the Wexit Party do better. We might see the Derek Fildes and the Mad Max. I don't remember what that party's called. The Independent Persons or something. The Freedom Party.
Freedom
the Freedomers. Party. Yes. We might see them make some inroads in rural areas. And I truly believe that is what Kenny is more afraid of. He's not afraid of the NDP. He is afraid of these break-off groups. One of the ways to tell where the power really is to watch who the government panders to. Klein really pandered to the farmers and the ruralites and the seniors. The NDP still does a lot of pandering to the left and the feminists and Indigenous persons. We know who our audience is, all of us. Jason Kenney is pandering to the far religious right wing in this province. They are setting the course for how we handle this pandemic. They are deciding how we go forward. So that says that's where not only where the power is in this province, but it's who Kenney is afraid of. Mm-hmm. He's afraid of the John Carpay-led faction. He's afraid of them not voting NDP because, of course, they never would. He's afraid of them aligning with either Wexit or Freedom Party candidates, and that would damage Kenney. Let's not forget the closest the PCAA ever got to losing an election was when the Wild Rose showed up, and they were to the right of the right-wing government of the day. So I think we're seeing Kenney in a state of fear about what's happening in areas that would be considered his base areas, Southern Alberta, rural Alberta, and his handling of the pandemic reflects that.
One of the conversation pieces that, I mean, we had a conversation with a gentleman from rural Alberta a little while back, and one of the pieces of that conversation that took place off camera was the question of the Alberta Party, and I've been pretty clear where I stand on the Alberta Party these days. I think so. There's not a whole lot of love lost there for me, but I'm curious. As much as we saw the Wild Rose take a more hard right approach to the PCAA and pick up quite a few seats, it almost seems like watching the Alberta Party when it's not on fire.
Which happens frequently. It loves to spontaneous combust on us.
Yeah, like you can smell it some days. But it seems like they're trying to take a slightly less right approach than the UCP. Now, to be clear, that's a major shift from where they were. So I think that they're big time changing their target demographic. But do you see the smoke signals from the Alberta Party having any sort of impact on the Conservatives who are tired of Jason Kenney, or are they just committing themselves to further mediocrity?
Well, I know there are some pundits and strategists who would like to think that the Alberta Party is going to cut into that UCP base. I don't see it because the Alberta Party had a chance in this province with mainstream centrists. Mainstream centrism does reflect the majority of Albertans. It's where the majority of Albertans stand. You know, we're all good with going to gay weddings as long as there's an open bar. That's Alberta, right? We're pretty much a centrist population. Unfortunately, we saw the Alberta Party move to the right.
Yeah.
Which didn't really make any sense to me. We have this black hole in the middle of our political spectrum where they could have set up shop, and instead they chose to move to the right. They decried the minimum wage increase. Oh, and that for me was a breaking point. I'm like, you're decrying that increase. Well, then you're anti-women. You know,
Yeah.
we make up the majority of minimum wage workers in this province. So don't tell me you're a centrist party and then come out against the minimum wage increase. I just saw them moving more and more to the right. I don't think they're going to get the votes they want there. If people have a choice between voting for an upstart right-wing party or the maybe not so great right-wing party that's tried and true to their base and have a better chance of winning, who are they going to vote for? It's sure as heck not going to be the Alberta Party.
Yeah.
The Alberta Party has not found their base or their audience yet. And their defensiveness isn't doing them any favors online either. Like, stop whining. You keep telling us you're building the party. Go build the party. Get off Twitter, stop being the Twitter party, and show us something we can believe in, and then we'll come to you. But this being so defensive about how people call out centrism and poor Alberta Party, I don't have time for that stuff, especially not in a crisis.
Yeah. It seems like, though, to their credit, at least the official accounts have left both Twitter and Facebook because their posts are very, very few and far between. One of the things that's interesting to me about sort of the decline of the Alberta Party is, and I think that we see this going with the conversation that we're having about the UCP as well, is it seems like political parties in Alberta are deathly afraid of showing any kind of leadership. It seems like what the political parties seem to do, at least for the last little while, is read the room of their base, and like you said, double down and pander to that. We're seeing this with Jason Kenney's approach to the pandemic. We're certainly seeing it from the other political parties. Why do you think it is that we don't have a political party in Alberta that is willing to say, you know what, guys, this is what we need to do, and we're going to do it, and if you don't like it, that's okay too, but this is what we need to do? Like, that's the kind of leadership that...
But and again, I have to say I'm not NDP, but I do think we saw that under Rachel Notley, and we saw the outcome of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, Notley did a lot of unfavorable things. The carbon tax is going to hang around her neck forever. She's got no way to lose that. And as much as the NDP can say, oh, we did campaign on it, no, you didn't. Now, do I think it was a good idea to bring it in? Absolutely. It needed to be done. It made us a player nationally and internationally, and it brought a heck of a lot of revenue into our government coffers that is now gone. But She did it. It was very unpopular. Also, the workers' bill. What was I'm it's
The farm one.
Yeah, yes, the farm bill. These were things that needed to be done to bring us in step with the rest of the world and with the rest of the country. But they were incredibly unpopular things that she pushed through anyway, and look at the result. So when we say, we're not seeing true leadership, we're not seeing courage. Well, we don't like courage, do we?
To the Notley piece, though, and this is to her credit, I will say this: I do agree that she showed some very strong leadership. I do agree that she showed some bold decision making. But I think, and she's acknowledged this recently, which I think is really interesting. I think where the NDP fell down with those decisions is not that they made those decisions. I don't think that they lost Albertans because they made those decisions. I think that their communication of those decisions and the reason for those decisions is where they fell down. And,
I would
and
agree with that.
and I think that she's acknowledged that recently. I mean, I saw a media availability she had a little while back, where she talked about the fact that the biggest mistake that the NDP made during their government was that they failed to communicate effectively with Albertans.
Yeah. Well, and here's a great juxtaposition because the NDP was a brand new government with a lot of inexperienced staffers and a lot of inexperienced MLAs. This was, I would never say it was an accidental government. There's no such thing as an accidental government.
No, that diminishes the voters.
It was definitely an unexpected government. I don't think they even expected to do as well as they did. And there's going to be a lot of hurdles for any new government, but for one that is comprised mainly of inexperienced persons, it's going to be difficult. However, you've got Rachel Notley going, yeah, man, our communication sucked. We should have done better at that. And then you've got the government of the day that has overpaid staffers who do nothing but like each other's tweets online all day long or insult us for $200,000 a year in pay. And they still won't communicate effectively with Albertans. And I think that juxtaposition is something that Albertans really need to think more about. It's okay to make mistakes, but I want a leader who says, yeah, we screwed that up and we own it. And right now, we're in a crisis of historic proportions, and we've got a government and government staffers who will never admit to erring, who will never say, I'm sorry. And if you can't admit an error, you cannot change and improve. And I think that should be our greatest concern right now with this UCP government. If they cannot accept their own failings, they cannot change those failings. And they'll just repeat the same mistakes over and over again.
That's one of the fascinating things to me as well with the response to, because as much as the pandemic is a governance crisis or what leadership crisis, whatever you want to call it, it's at its core, it's a health crisis. And when healthcare professionals are working on a crisis, whether it's with one patient or multiple patients, the overriding model that gets used is one that allows for course correction. The communication styles that are used inside of a code room or an operating room are very much, if I'm about to crap the bed, you have to tell me and I have to listen. And we'll debate whether or not I'm actually about to crap the bed, but we have to have that conversation, because if we don't have that conversation, then people die. And it seems like this government is more than willing to not have that conversation. And if anybody does try to have that conversation, then off with their heads.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to having a premier who has never been countered in his entire life. And it's a hard topic for me because yeah, I don't want to say that a single non-parent person is incapable of being a good leader. I mean, look at Nenshi. Nenshi's unmarried and has no children and doesn't have those experiences, those life experience that also lend themselves to leadership. But that doesn't make him a bad leader. I think it's whether or not you've had people in your life who stood up to you. I think it's whether you are surrounded by yes people, and Jason Kenney is, or whether you have people in your circle who will call you on stuff and maybe you reposition you if needs be. And we don't see that in this government. But that goes back to what I said about the meanness, about I'm the king of the castle, you're the dirty rascal approach to public communications that this government displays.
Yeah, one of the comments that I've seen circulating around is that while Kenny might be an effective manager, he's doesn't appear he appears to be failing the test of leadership right now.
Yeah. Well, I heard
But
Stephen Carter say it perfectly that Kenny is the king of campaigners, right?
yeah,
Kenny never loses a campaign. Kenny can glad hand and kiss babies and charm the guy at the top of the business tower in downtown Edmonton and the farmer out on the ranch in Airdrie. He has that ability, but there's governance to do beyond getting elected. And I just don't know if our premier has what it takes to govern. And he's definitely surrounded by people who aren't helping him in that arena.
I want to circle back to the conversation, the part of the conversation where we were talking about the fact that there's a large number of Albertans who aren't engaged in politics. One of the things that I think that this pandemic has forced to some degree is a higher level of engagement from people across the spectrum. One of my personal theories is one of the reasons why we're seeing so much ill-informed stuff being shared on social media is because we have a lot of people who are extremely new to politics and they're using a very, very small frame of reference to try to understand how the big machine moves. And they're jumping to the easiest conclusions. Again, I might be being too generous there, but that's sort of...
so I think
Yeah, I'd say you're being too generous. My take on it is we have for years now seen conservative governments, not just in Canada but all around the world, engage in science denialism so that they don't have to act on climate change. And now we are in a pandemic, we are in an international crisis where science is all that matters. So how do they now say to that same base that they've been saying to for years, don't believe the scientists, global warming is a fraud, it's all a hoax. Well, now they're going to tell that same base to believe the scientists? Like this is a created crisis, and it's created by political rhetoric. It's created by pseudoscience. It's created by politicians who take advantage of ignorance and, in some cases, stupidity to get what they want. And this is the outcome. And that's tragic. Like, I really want everyone to take a moment and think about the tragedy of that our politicians have sold anti-science for so long that now when our very lives depend on believing and accepting the science, too much of our population can't do it because they have been fed not to believe the scientists for so long that there's no way they will now believe.
The part of me looks at that and says that the only way that we're gonna move forward from the place that we're in regards to the science denialism is by having more conversations. And I've certainly said on record in multiple different formats that part of that includes having difficult conversations and having challenging conversations and demonstrating that it's possible to have these challenging conversations without it being a complete nullification of one's identity. You've started a new project.
Well, I haven't started a new project. I've joined on to an existing project.
Okay, let me rephrase that then. You are taking part in the evolution of an existing project. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. I have joined Political RND, their Women in Alberta Politics podcast. And the focus of that podcast is to engage women across the province, across the spectrum, and get women specifically talking about how they can become more involved, because I think we change politics and we change the world by ensuring that every voice is represented. And I think that matters, especially right now in Alberta, where we have a government that isn't kind to the ladies and is quite willing to download the burden, not only of an economic recession, but of a global pandemic onto working women.
So, I mean, when we're talking about political R&D, we're getting into the really inside baseball part of Alberta politics. So, can you? I mean, I've followed political R&D for quite some time, intermittently. Some of the personalities that they've had on, I've had challenges with, but I think the work that Deidre is doing is to me, it seems like political R&D has finally found its stride. And I think that the podcast that you guys are doing now is not only extremely important, but I think that's the thing. So can you tell us how you got involved with political R&D and sort of give us the broad strokes of where you want to see the ladies of Alberta, AB Poly, I think it's called?
Yes, women.
Yeah. Where's that women? I'm sorry, I got
in
trouble for I got in trouble for using the word ladies a little while ago, but it's just, to me, it's like a respect thing, and apparently that's changed, and I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, I know. Well, I have to correct myself too. I'm 53, and I still say sir and ma'am to people.
I do too.
And now that's assuming someone's gender identity, and my daughter has to constantly remind me, Mom, we don't say that anymore. I'm like, well, what do I say then? Well, why do you have to say anything? Just say thank you. Or, but it's an old habit to break.
I don't know about this getting old business.
It's hard. It's hard, especially in our grandparents had it easy. They just got old. They never had to change.
Exactly.
Now these kids demand that we, understand and change.
Great, but it's hard.
It is. Well, I think what we're hoping to do with this podcast is just continue amplifying the voices of women from around the province, but we specifically want to reach out to rural women. I think feminism forgets about women who are outside of the city. And as a woman who cut my teeth in politics in a small farming community, I know how isolating those bubbles can be for women. And I know how many women in those communities just sort of let their husband make the political decisions for them. Politics is what the men do at the Tim Hortons. Politics is what the men do sitting around the table after dinner, or what they talk about out in the field when they're by themselves. In those communities, political talk is almost akin to locker room talk. It's just for the boys. And I'm hoping Deirdre and I are building a community that will be open to all women, because I think that's lacking in our province. And I'm concerned about women in those communities, and I want to hear from them.
It's a fascinating format that you guys, ladies, damn it, women have built.
What is it? Justin Trudeau said we're people humans or something. It's fascinating what you people humans have done.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll just piss people off maybe as well. but it's a fascinating format that you've built, because it's in listening to the episodes that I have, it's been a very light conversational tone. I mean, I as we discussed in the preamble to the podcast proper, it feels like the AB Poly version of The View, but I need to be really clear. The caliber of women that you have on the show is insane. Like, you've got the heaviest of the heavy hitters of the AB Poly universe on there, and the commentary and the insight is like, man, I'm glad that I just have to play with puppets some days, because if I tried to match what you women are doing, I'm like, wow.
I think that's important for other women to hear, though. I think it's really important that women all over Alberta hear strong, dynamic, successful women expressing their opinions, because it inspires women to engage in the conversation with themselves. It inspires them to gather other women together to have those conversations, and that's what's so exciting. I mean, I'm not reticent at all to tell you or to share with your audience that we've had moments during our recording sessions that have brought all of us to tears. Our recent Survivors edition of the podcast, we were all on Zoom crying by the end of it, because what the interaction that happened between the four of us was so deep and so sincere and so moving that our emotions by the end were just bubbling over, and we've also we're trying to focus on not just making it a liberal women roundtable, an NDP women roundtable, or a white suburban ladies roundtable. We really want to present a spectrum of voices, because that's how others will start talking.
Well, it's yeah, like I said, it's remarkable how. I mean, one of the things that I often do is I kind of overlap the talk radio format with what a lot of podcasts do, and the manner in which you guys conduct yourselves, you women conduct yourselves. It's going to be the running joke for this episode. Is it's completely different than we see from a lot of talk radio personalities. The sense that I get is when you ladies are talking, there's no agenda. There's no sort of we're gonna push this thing, or we're gonna try to frame this thing in this particular way that we might see from, I don't know, certain talk radio hosts here in Calgary. But it's got a very, very natural flow to it, which I think is really quite something.
That's you've nailed our approach. We don't go into any episode with any kind of agenda, with any pre-designed outcome. And you only hear about, I think it's about 45 minutes Deirdre edits it down to. We've talked for almost 2 hours with some of our guests, and then we just edit that down to what we think the audience will enjoy most. But it's not an agenda-driven podcast. It's an engagement-driven podcast. And that's definitely going to be our focus on a go-forward basis.
Well, like I said, I think it's I have been following the little political R&D realm for, I think, since it started, to be honest with you. And this is the first time in the various incarnations of format that I've sort of gone, oh, they've got it.
We're excited. We're excited about it. I'm excited to see what the future brings for it. We are just the little podcast that could right now, and I'm so honored that Deirdre has welcomed me as a co-host. Like it's an honor to be able to speak with these women several times a week and learn so much from them. So I'm honored by being included, but most of all, I'm excited for what's to come.
Yeah, well, I definitely would for our audience. If you want to listen to a podcast that isn't just a white middle-aged man pontificating,
We need more of those in Alberta. There's not enough.
Well, that's the thing. I think that there's a lot of people who are involved in the political podcasting realm who take themselves way too seriously. And it makes it difficult for people to relate to it. And I'm probably as guilty of that as the next guy in some days, if not most. But the formula that you guys have seems to have managed to navigate completely clear of that iceberg, which is pretty cool.
It's coffee chat. No big whoop. It's the No Big Whoop podcast. Just pull up a chair.
Is there anything else that you would like people to know about the podcast?
Find us on Political RND.
Where do they find Political RND?
At Political RND is our Twitter account. So check that out. Yeah, it's RND, not RND.
Okay.
That's about all I got about the podcast. Tune in, hang out.
And you guys have started a Patreon page for the podcast as well, unless I'm mistaken.
Oh yeah, Deirdre handles all that stuff though. So yes, we have a Patreon page. I guess I should have looked into that a little bit better before talking to you. I think we have like 3 subscribers, so show us some love.
Exactly. So for our audience, if you're already a patron of The Breakdown, consider signing up to be a patron for Political R&D and subscribing to their podcast as well, because I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, please consider signing up to be a supporter on our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. If you're listening to this episode as the audio-only podcast, please consider leaving us a rating and a review, because that helps us get the podcast in front of more people. And finally, if you aren't already, please follow us on all of the social media platforms, all at The Breakdown AB. Thank you.